Good afternoon, fellow students and Mr. Amos. Today I will be speaking to you about one of the most influential financial crises within the modern world, the recession of 2008, also known as the Great Recession. Aside from the Great Depression, the 2008 financial crisis caused the most damage to the Canadian and world market. One thing you will realize throughout this presentation is that the problem, unlike the Great Depression, did not arise overnight or over the course of a few short days. The downfall of 2008 was a result of approximately 2 years of poor recovery of exports and trade within the international market. Lending of money was then downscaled drastically and was often turned down to those who were new to the banks or had not paid off previous loans. Without the loans, many small-scale companies were forced into bankruptcy and were then caused to sell their businesses to larger companies, thereby shrinking the global market. Eventually, people could no longer repay their debts, which created an atmosphere of uncertainty if banks would go bankrupt. As a result, small-scale companies were forced to sell to larger companies for a bargain price, triggering a startling amount of job loss. Initially, the recession began as a result of banks taking loans to create more money. However, within 7 years, they doubled the amount of money and debt in the economy. The excess production of money drove the global markets and banks into a downfall, as the banks could no longer support themselves. In turn, they began raising mortgages and interest rates on loans. Following the rather unorthodox turn of events, many were left jobless, without homes, or facing great debts for their stakes in the market. Many communities were able to recover by working together and supporting local businesses. However, on the political and global forefront, many exports and imports decreased and had raised prices in many companies' attempts to survive the recession with their businesses intact. At that point, employment rates dropped as well as GDPs, which triggered a devastation in many countries, especially throughout North America and Europe. Within the time frame of the recession, social media did not play a major role. However, the recession did lead the way to the social media we use today. During the recession, it was determined that it was necessary to have a more effective means of observing the constant status of the world markets at a moment's notice, and employers would need to communicate with their workers faster to compensate for changes occurring. In turn, this popularized Facebook and Twitter quite quickly to convey new information to the public. Many governments began to use media forms as a way to address the population and deliver them with updated information, or to simply give words of encouragement to those affected by the situation. The recession, for some regions, meant a shift in their entire government system because GDPs and employment were so dependent on imports and exports. As the cost increased, other regions would purchase less, leading to the closure of many companies. As a result, governments in Latvia and Iceland fell, and nearly started from scratch. Ultimately, in the long run, this was incredibly beneficial for the future of their countries, but caused some chaos and uncertainty initially. In more advanced governments, the recession simply led to new protocols and laws to protect its citizens, such as minimum wages and rules pertaining to the circumstances employees could be laid off. In some communities, the effect of the recession was all too evident, as not only was it affecting the global market and the cost of buying a home and certain imports, but also whether or not a person would be able to feed their family each week. For some, after having to sell off many of their possessions, such as their homes, cars, and other valuables to pay off debts to avoid living in a poverty state, real estate agents also lost their jobs over the course of 2008 to 2013 as a result of unreasonably high mortgage rates and a lack of demand for new housing. This led to a major decrease in the market of trades workers, architects, and housing directors, because no new housing was needed or affordable. Some more fortunate communities did not have near as much difficulty throughout this recession, and were able to continue life as normal. These areas are far more isolated communities which are able to be more self-dependent and self-sufficient. The recession officially ended in June 2009, which means that it lasted nearly 2 years. Within this time, many things took place, causing abrupt changes to the livelihood of many. As one would expect, this means that things could not simply return to a normal life right away. Although the governments of affected countries tried to provide help to those most in need in the following 2 years that it took many people to recover, there are even some who still face losses as a result of the recession. Following the Great Recession, there was a large amount of animosity towards the government for not having done more to help citizens during the recession and afterwards. To demonstrate to the government the desperate needs of the people, a protest began, called Occupy Wall Street. This movement was held in 2011, around the time the recession ended. The movement was designed for those who were not in the 1%, who were able to avoid all effects of the recession. In other words, this means anyone who may have lost a business or a job, or simply was suffering as a result of the poor level of aid provided. Many were outraged by this protest, as those working on Wall Street claimed that they also felt the effects deeply of the recession. although were not quite as directly affected as those who protested. The striking image behind me of the girl gracefully dancing on top of the bull was meant to signify those who were unaffected, while those on the ground wearing gas masks and striding forward with linked arms were meant to symbolize the other 99% who suffered and were forced to face the issue head-on. Now please enjoy the following video of the Wall Street protest.
House protesters took to the streets all over the country to oppose a Wall Street bailout. In New York, a series of demonstrations occurred near the stock exchange. This is a sampling of some of the voices on the streets.
We pay! We own! Foreclose Wall Street, not my home! We pay! We own! Foreclose Wall Street!
People on Wall Street do not know the difference between right and wrong. They do not know that it's wrong to lie, it's wrong to steal, and then when they make a few mistakes, they want us to pay for it.
They may give it some window dressing about limiting executive compensation, but the real goal is to transfer huge funds to the investment banks, to the hedge funds, to central banks that created this mess in the first place.
This is like 1, 2, 3. 1, the Iraq War, $700 billion out of our back pocket. 2, the energy situation, the record profits while we pay for it at the gas tank. And now 3, Wall Street, in terms of looking for another $700 billion on top of all that's been done.
I'm very concerned about the economic circumstance right now, and at the same time trying to understand what is happening and what the things that the politicians are trying to do.
The have-nots, or the haves, just keep on having. Bail me out. I go to college. I have a job.
You're talking about a bailout for like some of the wealthiest banks in the world, but yet we can't seem to help our own citizens who are having foreclosure crises. I mean, in President Bush's speech the other night, he mentioned all the reasons for the mortgage meltdown, but then once mentioned predatory mortgage lending.
What's your thoughts hearing this protest today?
Look, I can totally understand their issues, but I think not bailing out will end up being worse for the country as a whole.
Come up with another solution. I mean, there is no other solution. I mean, I think that the government should get a lot of equity for what they purchase, but there's no option.
Which isn't being proposed right now, though. So do you support the bailout in its current incarnation?
It's something that's been done. You pull something that's already been put on the table now, the country will go into a spiraling depression.
I think it's great for the economy. I mean, obviously, there'll be a massive downturn if the government didn't bail them out. I mean, Wall Street is a massive part of the US economy. If that was to crumble, then a lot of other knock-on effects would happen. The housing market would go down. I think there'd be a detrimental effect to the whole US economy if that happened.
Okay, it seems like a lot of money at the time, but it's all going to get paid back in 18 months. They're coming together, all these companies are going to have to refinance. It's not as if the US government isn't going to see this money again. And in terms of the economy in the long run, a company like AIG, if that goes down, the knock-on effect is going to go right down to the consumer.
Personally, I'm a firm believer of, if the company choose to fail, let them fail. But if it's going to trickle down to everyone else, we'd have to see what the real details are.
I'm amazed that the federal government has so much money to bail out the investment companies that have made unwise decisions and created huge losses to their shareholders, while they always say they don't have money for things like affordable housing and more parks and health care.
When the financial guys win, they win alone, and when the financial guys lose, the taxpayer is losing, and that it's not fair, it's not justice.
Voices outside Wall Street here on Democracy Now!, democracynow.org. Special thanks to Aaron Mate and Hani Massoud. I'm Amy Goodman with Juan Gonzalez. Also thanks to our guest Michael Zweig of Stony Brook and Paul Krugman of Princeton University and the New York Times. As we switch gears now to Iran. Juan?
Well, the U.S. Ambassador Ryan Crocker accused Iran late Thursday of trying to derail an agreement that would allow U.S. troops to stay in Iraq beyond the UN mandate, which expires at the end of the year. The Iraqi Prime Minister, Nouri Maliki, has reportedly called for all U.S. troops to withdraw by the end of 2001. Ambassador Crocker also alleged that Iran is deepening its ties to Shiite militias inside Iraq that are affiliated with the radical anti-American cleric Muqtada al-Sadr.
We now turn to part 2 of our interview with the Iranian President Mahmoud Ahmadinejad.
The response to the recession crisis resulted in an overall positive outcome for Canada. Canada's federal government took a stance of what appeared to be a delay. While other countries were putting trillions of dollars in stimulus packages to generate consumer and export strength, Canada assumed a suppressive response. By some Canadians and financial experts' point of view, the Canadian government's lack of immediate response was inappropriate and incongruent to the crisis. After receiving backlash for their non-response, the federal government offered a stimulus package by Canadians that was only a quarter of the $40 billion spent by the United States. Canada's response, nationally and internationally, appeared to be strong but minimalistic. As a result of Canada's response to stifle spending, the country overall was able to generate 7,100 jobs and reduce the unemployment rate by 7.2%. Internationally, Canada received praise and envy for economic growth. Stats Canada reported the recession to be the shortest and mildest for Canada within the G7 countries. As with every crisis, there will always be those who will try to use it to their own advantage, or achieve greater profits off the losses of others. In this case of the recession of 2008, loaning companies as well as large-scale industry companies used the situation to their benefit, as they bought smaller companies who would no longer sustain themselves for bargain prices, and then, following the recession, could resell the companies for a large profit. Loaning companies such as Cash Now or Money Mart were able to benefit off those who could not receive loans from banks and who were at risk of bankruptcy after selling off their commodities. Following the recession, there were not many chances for workers to regain their status. However, it would seem that the recession did lead to a better life for some. In a study conducted by the U.S. Census Bureau, it was discovered that the following of the recession led to entrepreneurships being increased by 17%. So it was clear that many had determined that owning their own business would be more secure, as they could then make executive business decisions and control the hiring or termination of workers. This was likely a factor of a large majority of them having been laid off during the recession. In addition, many of the new entrepreneurs opened companies involved in the trades. This is likely a result of them wanting to support their own communities, as opposed to starting industrial companies whose products would need to be shipped elsewhere for the sake of business, leaving them at the mercy of a global market, as they had been when the recession began. As of 2011, the recession was over. Although many companies, primarily those manufacturing and exporting products internationally, were still affected by the recession, although the overall rebound for Canada was quick. Currently, Canada's economic status is feeling the effects from international partners. Canada's exports in the early months of 2017 have struggled to compete in the global market due to uncertainty with our closest and one of our primary trade partners, the United States. Recent talks of President Trump wanting to renegotiate the NAFTA trade deal between the United States, Canada, and Mexico has created some political unrest. Additionally, Canada's housing market has caused housing to be out of reach for many Canadian home buyers. The high cost of buying homes, primarily in Vancouver and Toronto, has families carrying a high amount of debt. According to Statistics Canada, Canada's economy is increasing at a very high rate, which may cause the Bank of Canada to increase rates to help slow housing prices. The unemployment rate for April 2017 is 6.6%, with an expected 2.8% increase in the gross domestic product, primarily through increasing the average home income, government spending, and continued low interest rates, which typically motivates spending. Thank you for watching. I hope you enjoyed my presentation.